Barron Trump, wearing a bright red MAGA hat, stepped into the restaurant, turning every head in the room. Shocked but calm, Barron complied, but what he did after walking out left everyone stunned. Why would one small act spark such a massive reaction and ripple across the city? Let us dive into this incredible moment that caused the whole city to vote for Trump in the elections. A dinner like no one expected. On this particular evening, the staff hustled to prepare for the dinner rush. Waiters adjusted the placement of cutlery, their white gloves making everything feel even more precise. The chef barked instructions in the kitchen as flames danced from sizzling pans. All seemed routine until the door swung open and in walked someone who turned every head in the room. It wasn't a celebrity. Not exactly. It was Barron Trump. Before we delve into this, it's clear that what unfolded after Barron's entrance was far more dramatic than anyone in the room could have anticipated, and it's not the only twist to this story. He stood tall, already towering over most adults, despite being just a teenager. His presence was striking, not because of arrogance, but because of how effortlessly he carried himself. His features mirrored the sharp angles and poise of his family, but his expression was calm, almost detached, as if he didn't care about the weight of the name he carried. What caught everyone's attention most, however, wasn't his face or stature. It was the bright red MAGA hat perched confidently on his head. For a moment, silence rippled through the room, the kind of silence that wasn't loud but heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The diners exchanged furtive glances, their curiosity barely concealed. Some looked intrigued, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The staff, trained to maintain composure under any circumstance, faltered slightly in their movements. All of it was subtle, yet palpable. Behind the counter, Robert Gray, the restaurant's manager, watched it all unfold. Robert was a man who took pride in running a tight ship. He had worked tirelessly to carve out his career, climbing the ranks from dishwasher to manager of one of New York's most prestigious establishments. His sharp suit and neatly trimmed beard spoke of his attention to detail. But there was one thing he was known for even more: his unyielding opinions. Robert was as politically vocal as they came, never one to shy away from sharing his stance, even in a setting that demanded neutrality. As his eyes locked onto Barron, Robert's expression darkened. To him, the red hat wasn't just a hat. It was a statement, a provocation, a symbol that stood for everything he despised. And here it was, sitting on the head of someone who had the audacity to walk into his restaurant. A flicker of unease danced across his face, but he quickly masked it with a tight smile. Barron moved with purpose, heading toward a table near the back. He sat down quietly, placing the hat on the table beside him. He didn't look around to see who was watching. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling, seemingly oblivious to the buzz he'd caused. For him, this was just another evening, but for Robert, it was anything but. The staff hesitated. Should they serve him as they would anyone else? Should they pretend not to notice the hat? The whispers among them grew louder, though they were careful not to let them reach Barron's ears. Robert, however, had no intention of tiptoeing around the issue. He squared his shoulders and marched toward Barron's table, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor. "Excuse me, sir," Robert said, his voice low but firm. Every word was laced with an edge, though he kept a veneer of professionalism. The diners closest to Barron's table leaned in ever so slightly, their interest piqued. Barron looked up, his face neutral. He didn't react the way most teenagers might have. No fidgeting, no defensiveness. Instead, he held Robert's gaze, his expression unreadable. It was as if he already knew where this was going. Robert gestured toward the hat. "We have a dress code here," he said, though the words were carefully chosen. He didn't say politics or MAGA outright, but everyone knew what he meant. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove it." For a split second, something flickered in Barron's eyes, a mix of surprise and resolve. He didn't argue. He didn't explain himself. Instead, he calmly picked up the hat, stood, and walked toward the door without saying a word. It was a simple action, but it spoke volumes. The room seemed to exhale all at once, the tension easing as the door closed behind him. But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. Outside, the cool evening air greeted Barron as he stepped onto the sidewalk. He placed the hat back on his head, adjusting it slightly before slipping his hands into his pockets. Anyone passing by might have thought he was just another kid enjoying a night out. But inside the restaurant, the fallout had already begun. Whispers turned into murmurs, and murmurs turned into full-blown conversations. Some diners praised Robert for taking a stand, while others questioned his judgment. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether they admired their boss's conviction or feared its consequences. One thing was clear: this was no ordinary evening, and the ripples of what had just happened were bound to grow into waves. Robert returned to his post, his expression betraying no regret. In his mind, he had done what needed to be done, but as the evening unfolded, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And he was right, because what Barron Trump did next would leave everyone, Robert included, utterly stunned. The restaurant buzzed with quiet energy as the dinner service reached its peak. Plates clinked softly against the tables, and conversations hummed in muted tones. Yet amidst this, a new kind of tension had settled in. Barron Trump sat alone at a corner table, his striking red MAGA hat resting prominently on his head. What should have been an ordinary evening meal was quickly turning into a spectacle. From the moment Barron entered, whispers had spread like wildfire among the staff and patrons. Eyes darted toward him, some filled with curiosity, others with disdain. The hat seemed to carry a gravity of its own, a beacon of controversy that no one could ignore. Waiters hesitated as they approached his table, unsure of how to act. Even the diners, who tried to maintain their composure, couldn't help but steal glances, their hushed conversations betraying their unease. Robert Gray, the manager, stood behind the counter, observing the scene unfold. He prided himself on maintaining order and professionalism in his establishment, but this was a test unlike any he had faced before. His jaw tightened as he watched the reactions around the room. The hat wasn't just a piece of clothing to him. It was a statement that clashed with his values, and he wasn't about to let it slide. Determined to address the situation, Robert straightened his tie and made his way toward Barron's table. His steps were deliberate, each one echoing the weight of his decision. As he approached, the murmurs quieted, and all eyes turned to the unfolding confrontation. "Good evening," Robert began, his tone measured but cool. He stood tall, his hands clasped in front of him as if to project authority. "I hope you're enjoying your time here." Barron looked up from his menu, his expression calm and polite. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady. He didn't seem fazed by the manager's approach, nor did he appear to notice the tension in the room. Robert's eyes flicked to the hat. "I need to inform you that we have a dress code here," he continued, his words carefully chosen. "Hats are generally not permitted in the dining area." Barron's brow furrowed slightly, but his demeanor remained composed. "I didn't see any notice about that," he replied. "Is it posted somewhere?" The question hung in the air, its simplicity disarming. Robert hesitated for a moment, the crack in his confidence barely noticeable. "It's an unspoken rule," he said after a beat. "We expect our patrons to adhere to a certain standard of decorum." Barron nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I see, but if it's not posted, how would I have known?" Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath. The patrons who had been pretending not to watch were now fully invested, their attention fixed on the exchange. Some looked impressed by Barron's calm logic. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, anticipating what would come next. Robert's patience was wearing thin. He had expected compliance, not resistance. "I'm asking you to remove the hat," he said, his tone sharpening. "If you choose not to, I'll have to ask you to leave." The escalation sent ripples through the crowd. Gasps and murmurs filled the room as people exchanged incredulous looks. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of the confrontation. Barron's expression didn't change. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture relaxed but firm. "With all due respect, sir," he said evenly, "I believe I have the right to dine here like anyone else. Unless there's a specific rule against hats, I'd like to stay." The words were polite, almost disarmingly so, but their impact was undeniable. Robert's face flushed as he struggled to maintain his composure. To him, this wasn't just about the hat. It was about principle, about the kind of environment he wanted to cultivate in his restaurant. But to everyone else in the room, it was starting to look like something else entirely. The tension reached its breaking point as Robert made his decision. "I'm sorry, but I must insist," he said, his voice firm. "If you don't comply, I'll have no choice but to escort you out." Barron didn't flinch. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Picking up the hat from the table, he held it in his hands for a moment before placing it back on his head. "Thank you for your time," he said, his tone polite but tinged with finality. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward the exit. As the door closed behind him, the room erupted. Conversations broke out at every table, the diners' voices rising in a mix of outrage, admiration, and disbelief. Some applauded Robert for standing his ground. Others criticized him for what they saw as an overreaction. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of where they stood in the unfolding drama. Robert returned to his post, his expression grim. He had won the confrontation, but the victory felt hollow. The whispers and stares that followed him made it clear that the evening's events were far from over. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line, one that might come back to haunt him. Outside, Barron stepped into the night, the cool air brushing against his face. He adjusted his hat and walked away, his stride steady and unhurried. Whatever emotions he might have felt, he kept them hidden, his composure unshaken. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the last time the restaurant would hear his name. The events of that evening were already set in motion, and the ripples were bound to grow into something much larger. Barron walked into the cool night, leaving behind a room full of questions, while someone nearby stayed hidden, watching him closely. A quiet walk into the night. Barron Trump exited the restaurant with an unshaken composure, his shoulders squared as he stepped into the cool Manhattan night. The buzz of the city seemed to amplify the moment, drawing the attention of passers-by who paused to observe the striking figure walking down the street. His red MAGA hat, perched confidently atop his head, stood out like a beacon in the bustling crowd. There was something captivating about his quiet dignity, a calm assurance that seemed to defy the tension he had just left behind. Among the onlookers, a figure lingered in the shadows, partially obscured by the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Dressed in a dark overcoat, the individual's gaze followed Barron's every move, their presence subtle but deliberate. They appeared to blend into the background, unnoticed by most, yet their intense focus suggested they were anything but a casual observer. As Barron disappeared into the throng of pedestrians, the figure remained unmoving, as if calculating their next move. Inside the restaurant, the air was heavy with the aftermath of the confrontation. Robert Gray stood behind the counter, his smug expression barely concealing his satisfaction. To him, the evening had gone as expected. He had made a statement, asserted his authority, and upheld what he believed to be the principles of his establishment. Yet, beneath his self-assured exterior, a subtle unease began to creep in. The staff moved about the room with a visible tension, their usual precision replaced by an air of discomfort. Waiters avoided making eye contact with Robert, their movements stiff and mechanical. The diners, too, seemed unsettled. Conversations that had once been lively were now hushed, punctuated by furtive glances toward the entrance, as if expecting Barron to return. At first, Robert dismissed the atmosphere as a natural response to the evening's events. He convinced himself that he had done the right thing, that his actions would be lauded by those who shared his convictions. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease grew harder to ignore. Whispers reached his ears, fragments of conversations among patrons that hinted at disapproval. Words like excessive, unnecessary, and disrespectful floated through the air, chipping away at his confidence. Unbeknownst to Robert, the incident was already gaining traction beyond the restaurant's walls. Patrons who had witnessed the confrontation had taken to social media, their posts quickly gaining momentum. Photos of Barron's departure, accompanied by captions detailing the altercation, flooded Twitter and Instagram. The bright red hat became a symbol of the evening, its significance debated and dissected by users from all walks of life. By the time Robert realized the scope of the situation, it was too late. The restaurant's name was trending, accompanied by hashtags that painted a less than flattering picture of the evening's events. Some posts praised Robert for his stance, calling him a hero for standing up against what they perceived as a divisive symbol. Others, however, were far more critical, accusing him of overstepping his bounds and targeting a teenager unfairly. As Robert scrolled through the growing stream of posts, his smugness began to waver. The initial wave of praise had been drowned out by a flood of criticism, the voices of dissent far louder than he had anticipated. Each tweet and comment felt like a blow, eroding the confidence he had felt only moments before. The realization that his actions had sparked a social media frenzy filled him with a gnawing dread. Meanwhile, outside the restaurant, the strange figure had vanished as quietly as they had appeared. The city's relentless energy surged on, oblivious to the brewing storm. Yet, for those who had witnessed the evening's events, the night would not be easily forgotten. Barron's quiet exit and the shadowy presence that had watched him leave added an air of intrigue to an already contentious story. The restaurant's patrons, now aware of the online backlash, exchanged uneasy glances as they continued their meals. Some whispered about the potential repercussions for Robert and the establishment, their voices tinged with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Others took out their phones, eager to contribute their own accounts to the growing narrative. The room, once a haven of exclusivity and refinement, now felt charged with a new and uncomfortable energy. Robert's unease deepened as the night wore on. The weight of the social media frenzy pressed heavily on his mind, each notification on his phone a reminder of the situation spiraling out of his control. The criticism stung not just because it was unexpected, but because it highlighted a truth he had been unwilling to face. His actions, intended to assert authority, had instead painted him as the villain in a story far larger than he could have imagined. As the last diners trickled out and the staff began to close up for the night, the restaurant's usual elegance felt like a facade. The pristine tablecloths and gleaming chandeliers couldn't mask the undercurrent of tension that lingered in the air. Robert retreated to his office, seeking solace in the familiar surroundings, but even there, he found no escape. The images and words from social media played on a loop in his mind, a relentless reminder of the night's events. Outside, the city continued to buzz with life, the incident at the restaurant just one thread in his vast tapestry. Yet, for those involved, the repercussions were just beginning. The strange figure who had watched Barron leave remained a question, their intentions unclear but undeniably significant. And as the night stretched on, it became increasingly evident that the story was far from over. The ripples of the evening's events were bound to grow, their impact reaching far beyond the confines of the restaurant and its patrons. The morning after the incident, the internet was ablaze. The video of Barron Trump's quiet departure from the restaurant, coupled with the confrontation that had taken place, spread like wildfire across social media. Captured by an observant diner, the footage painted a vivid picture of the evening. The red MAGA hat stood out sharply in the frame, a symbol now carrying far more weight than anyone could have predicted. Within hours, the clip had been shared tens of thousands of times, and the hashtag #MAGAConflict was trending nationwide. The restaurant's name became synonymous with the debate, turning it into a battleground for political opinions. On one side were those who praised the establishment for taking a stand against what they considered a divisive symbol. On the other side were those who lambasted the act as a blatant display of discrimination and poor judgment. The polarized discourse brought waves of attention, but not all of it was welcome. As the online debate raged, the restaurant's reputation began to suffer tangible consequences. Negative reviews flooded every platform where the establishment was listed. Once pristine ratings were tarnished by one-star reviews accompanied by scathing comments. Some reviewers claimed they would never support a business that engaged in such behavior, while others accused the restaurant of prioritizing politics over professionalism. The backlash wasn't limited to the virtual world. The restaurant's phone lines were inundated with angry calls, and the once steady stream of bookings began to dry up. For Robert Gray, the sudden fallout was both overwhelming and infuriating. He had stood by his principles, believing he was defending the integrity of his establishment, but the response was far beyond anything he had anticipated. The restaurant, once a haven of exclusivity and prestige, was now under siege from a storm of criticism. Despite the mounting pressure, Robert remained resolute. He saw himself as a figure standing firm against the tide, unwilling to back down, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. The growing controversy eventually caught the attention of local news outlets, which only added fuel to the fire. Reporters camped outside the restaurant, their cameras aimed at the entrance, eager to capture any developments. Headlines screamed about the incident, framing it as a flashpoint in the ongoing cultural divide. The narrative took on a life of its own, with each side seizing the story to bolster their arguments. Some called Robert a hero for enforcing his policies. Others labeled him a villain for targeting a teenager based on his family name and political affiliation. In the midst of the chaos, Robert decided to address the situation head-on. He agreed to an exclusive interview with a prominent news network, determined to present his side of the story. The interview, filmed in the restaurant's elegant dining room, began with a recap of the events that had unfolded. Robert sat confidently in his chair, his posture exuding determination. He spoke passionately about his reasons for enforcing the supposed dress code, framing it as an effort to maintain the restaurant's standards and atmosphere. The tone of the interview was fiery and unapologetic. Robert doubled down on his actions, describing them as necessary and justified. He emphasized his belief that the red MAGA hat represented more than just a political statement. To him, it was a symbol of divisiveness that had no place in his establishment. He spoke about the importance of creating a welcoming environment for all patrons, arguing that his decision had been made in service of that goal. While the interview was intended to sway public opinion in his favor, it had the opposite effect for many. Clips of Robert's statements were shared widely on social media, often accompanied by heated commentary. Some praised his conviction, while others found his words incendiary and tone-deaf. The divide between supporters and critics grew even wider, turning the incident into a national talking point. As the backlash continued to mount, the restaurant staff found themselves caught in the crossfire. Employees reported being harassed online, their names and photos shared without consent by individuals seeking to make them targets. The once prestigious establishment now felt like a pressure cooker, the atmosphere inside thick with stress and uncertainty. Some staff members began to question their future at the restaurant, unsure if they wanted to remain tied to an environment that had become so fraught with controversy. The financial impact of the backlash became increasingly evident. The restaurant's reservations plummeted, with regular patrons canceling their bookings in droves. Private events were called off, and the once coveted tables sat empty during peak hours. Suppliers and business partners, expressed concern over their association with the establishment, worry of the potential damage to their own reputations. The ripple effects of the incident were felt far beyond the walls of the restaurant, affecting everyone connected to it. Despite the mounting challenges, Robert refused to back down. He continued to defend his actions publicly, doubling down on his stance in follow-up interviews and social media posts. To his supporters, he was a beacon of integrity, unafraid to stand up for his principles. To his detractors, he was a symbol of arrogance and misplaced priorities, a man more concerned with making a statement than with running a business. The strange figure who had observed Barron's departure remained a question, their intentions unclear. Speculation swirled online about their identity and connection to the incident, with some suggesting they might have been a security detail, a journalist, or even someone with ties to Barron himself. The intrigue surrounding their presence only added another layer of complexity to an already convoluted story. As the days turned into weeks, the story showed no signs of fading from the public consciousness. Each new development, whether a statement from Robert, a social media post from a patron, or a fresh piece of speculation about the strange figure, kept the narrative alive. The restaurant's name remained in the headlines, its reputation irrevocably tied to the events of that fateful evening. Amid the chaos, Barron Trump's own response, or lack thereof, became a point of fascination. His silent departure from the restaurant had been a moment of calm in the storm, a dignified exit that left many wondering what he thought of the uproar. Speculation about his next move ran rampant, with some predicting a public statement while others argued that his silence spoke volumes. Whatever his intentions, his role in the story remained a focal point for those following the saga. As the fallout continued to unfold, it became clear that the incident had become more than just a controversy about a hat or a restaurant's policies. It was a reflection of the deep divisions within society, a flashpoint that exposed the fault lines running through culture and politics. The restaurant, once a symbol of refinement and exclusivity, now stood at the center of a debate that transcended its walls. For Robert, the road ahead was uncertain. He had set out to defend his principles, but the consequences of his actions had spiraled far beyond his control. The once thriving establishment he had worked so hard to build was now struggling to stay afloat, its future hanging in the balance. Yet, even in the face of adversity, he remained steadfast, convinced that he had done the right thing. The moment might have passed, but what happened next spread far and wide as people wondered what Barron would do now. The chess move no one saw coming. The uproar surrounding the restaurant incident continued to dominate headlines, yet Barron Trump's response was notably absent. As the world speculated about his thoughts and plans, Barron maintained a strange silence that only deepened the intrigue. He had always been a figure who operated quietly, his life shielded by a level of privacy few could achieve. Now, in the wake of a public spectacle that had thrust him into the spotlight, his silence became its own kind of statement. The absence of a response spoke louder than any words might have, leaving people to wonder whether he was biding his time or simply choosing not to engage. Speculation ran wild as pundits, social media users, and journalists attempted to fill in the blanks. Some painted Barron as a victim of overreach, unfairly targeted for his association with a controversial figure. Others speculated that his silence was a strategic move, a calculated decision to let the controversy simmer before making a decisive move. Rumors of behind-the-scenes activity began to circulate, with whispers of private meetings and clandestine phone calls fueling the narrative. Yet, no concrete evidence emerged, leaving the public in a state of suspended anticipation. While the world debated his next steps, Barron's private life continued with an almost eerie normalcy. Within the confines of his home, he appeared unaffected by the chaos unfolding beyond its walls. His days were structured and deliberate, filled with quiet activities that hinted at a mind working steadily towards something larger. He spent hours in a sunlit study, surrounded by books and papers that bore no outward sign of their purpose. Occasionally, he would retreat to a secluded corner of the property, his phone in hand as he typed messages or made calls that no one could overhear. To those observing from the outside, it was impossible to discern whether these actions were related to the incident or simply the routine of a disciplined young man. Hints of a plan began to emerge in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. Packages arrived at the house, their contents unknown but clearly significant. Visitors came and went, their identities concealed behind tinted car windows. Each new detail added to the growing sense of anticipation, creating an atmosphere of quiet tension that seemed to hum beneath the surface. Even those closest to Barron were left guessing, their own questions met with the same composed silence that had become his hallmark. The first tangible sign of a broader strategy came in the form of a cryptic social media post from an account widely believed to be connected to Barron. The post contained no words, only an image, a lone chess piece placed in the center of a board, its position suggesting the opening move of a complex game. The internet erupted with speculation, each theory more elaborate than the last. To some, the post signified a deliberate challenge to those who had underestimated him. To others, it was a symbolic declaration of intent, a signal that he was ready to engage on his terms. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers grew louder. Barron was said to be meeting with advisors, strategists, and individuals with expertise in fields far removed from the world of politics. The meetings were shrouded in secrecy, their locations carefully chosen to avoid unwanted attention. Despite the intense scrutiny surrounding him, Barron's movements remained elusive, his ability to evade the public eye adding to his mystique. Each new piece of information, however small, served to deepen the intrigue and fuel the narrative that something significant was on the horizon. The world watched and waited, their collective gaze fixed on a figure who refused to conform to their expectations. While others might have been overwhelmed by the weight of public scrutiny, Barron seemed to thrive in the shadows, his quiet determination a stark contrast to the noise surrounding him. It was clear that he was not content to let the incident define him. Instead, he appeared to be crafting a response that would transcend the moment and leave a lasting impact. The questions surrounding Barron's plans extended beyond his immediate actions. Reports surfaced of unusual activity connected to his name, from charitable donations made anonymously to investments in ventures aimed at fostering dialogue and understanding. Each new revelation added another layer to the story, painting a picture of a young man who was both thoughtful and deliberate in his approach. Far from being reactive, Barron's actions suggested a level of foresight and strategy that few had anticipated. As the pieces of the problem began to fall into place, it became evident that Barron's silence had not been an absence of action, but a calculated decision to act on his own terms. His refusal to be drawn into the fray had allowed him to maintain control of the narrative, turning the focus away from the incident itself and toward the larger implications of his response. The world's fascination with him only grew, each new detail serving to deepen the intrigue and heighten the anticipation for what was to come. The ripple effects of Barron's unseen response extended far beyond the immediate controversy. The restaurant that had been the site of the incident continued to feel the impact of its actions, its reputation and financial stability eroded by the ongoing backlash. Meanwhile, Barron's ability to navigate the situation with poise and restraint began to draw admiration from unexpected quarters. His actions, or lack thereof, became a case study in the power of silence and the art of strategic thinking. The restaurant, once a symbol of prestige and exclusivity, had become a shadow of its former self. Protests lined the sidewalks outside its polished glass windows, a stark contrast to the quiet elegance that used to define the establishment. Crowds held signs, their messages ranging from political slogans to calls for accountability. The once steady flow of patrons dwindled to a trickle, and the dining room, once filled with lively conversations and clinking glasses, now echoed with an uneasy silence. Inside, the staff faced a different kind of chaos. Reservations that had been booked months in advance were being canceled en masse, leaving tables empty during peak hours. Waiters and kitchen staff, many of whom had once taken pride in working at such a renowned establishment, began handing in their resignations. The mounting pressure and hostile environment proved too much for many, and the exodus only worsened the restaurant's ability to function. The vacancies left behind added to the sense of a crumbling foundation, one that seemed impossible to stabilize. Robert Gray, the once confident manager, found himself increasingly isolated. Initially, he had felt a surge of pride in standing by his principles, believing that his actions would be celebrated by like-minded individuals. But as the backlash grew, his support began to dwindle. Those who had once lauded his decision now questioned whether it had been worth the fallout. Business partners distanced themselves, and even personal friends became scarce, unwilling to be associated with the escalating controversy. The financial impact was devastating. Revenue plummeted as the restaurant struggled to attract new patrons, and even longtime regulars found excuses to stay away. Suppliers, wary of their own reputations, began to delay deliveries or cut ties altogether. The restaurant's pristine reputation, built over years of meticulous effort, had been reduced to a cautionary tale. Bills piled up, and the once thriving business teetered on the brink of insolvency. Robert's personal life mirrored the collapse of his professional world. He became the target of relentless personal attacks, both online and offline. Social media platforms were flooded with vitriol, much of it aimed directly at him. Anonymous messages filled his inbox, ranging from scathing critiques to outright threats. Even his home, once a sanctuary, became a point of vulnerability as protesters occasionally gathered outside, their chants breaking the quiet of the neighborhood. Each passing day chipped away at Robert's resolve. The stress and isolation took a visible toll, his once sharp appearance now marked by dark circles under his eyes and a weariness in his posture. He spent long hours in his office staring at spreadsheets that told the same grim story. The walls of his world were closing in, and for the first time he began to question the decisions that had led him to this point. In the midst of this chaos, a curious development added a new layer of uncertainty. One morning, as Robert arrived at the restaurant, he found a plain envelope waiting for him on his desk. There was no return address, and the handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its message brief but cryptic. The words were carefully chosen, each one carrying a weight that was impossible to ignore. The letter didn't name names or make direct accusations. Instead, it hinted at something larger, a force or event that had yet to reveal itself. Phrases like, "What's coming cannot be stopped," and "You are only the beginning" stood out, their implications chilling. There was no signature, no indication of who might have sent it or why. Yet, the letter's tone made it clear that Robert's troubles were far from over. The letter left Robert unsettled in a way that nothing else had. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the feeling they evoked, a sense of inevitability, as though the events unfolding around him were part of a much larger narrative. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that his every move was being scrutinized by an unseen force. It was a paranoia that crept into every aspect of his life, adding to the weight of the pressure he was already under. As the days passed, the protests outside the restaurant grew louder, their numbers swelling with each new development in the controversy. The media continued to cover the story, framing it as a symbol of the cultural and political divisions tearing through society. Robert, once a respected figure in the world of fine dining, had become a lightning rod for criticism and outrage. His name was now synonymous with the very conflict he had sought to address, a cautionary tale for anyone tempted to blur the lines between business and personal beliefs. The restaurant's decline seemed irreversible. The remaining staff worked in a state of constant anxiety, their loyalty tested by the unrelenting chaos. Customers who did walk through the doors often came out of curiosity rather than genuine interest, their presence a reminder of how far the establishment had fallen. Each empty table, each canceled reservation was a testament to the cost of the decisions Robert had made, and yet amidst the wreckage, Robert clung to a sliver of hope. The letter, unsettling as it was, also carried a strange sense of possibility. Its cryptic message hinted at forces beyond his understanding, forces that might yet shift the tide. He found himself returning to his words again and again, searching for meaning, for a way to make sense of the chaos that had consumed his life. But even as he sought answers, the reality of his situation remained stark. The restaurant, once a beacon of success, was now on the brink of closure. His reputation, carefully cultivated over years of hard work, lay in ruins, and the world, far from moving on, seemed intent on ensuring that the story of his downfall would not be forgotten. Robert's isolation deepened, each day feeling longer and more oppressive than the last. The walls of his office, once a space of comfort and productivity, now felt suffocating. The financial strain, the public scrutiny, and the weight of his own decisions bore down on him with a relentless force. He had once believed himself capable of weathering any storm, but this was unlike anything he had ever faced. As he stared out the window of his office, the protests continuing below, Robert couldn't help but wonder what would come next. The letter's cryptic hints loomed large in his mind, its promise of something bigger casting a shadow over his thoughts. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground beneath him crumbling, the future uncertain. And yet, amidst the chaos and despair, a small part of him clung to the hope that there was still a way forward, a way to rebuild from the ruins of his once thriving world. It looked like things were over, but across the street, Barron was quietly working on something that would surprise everyone. A new restaurant brings hope. While the fallout from the restaurant incident continued to dominate headlines, Barron Trump had been quietly working behind the scenes. The whispers of meetings, packages, and cryptic social media posts now came into focus as his plan unfolded. Across the street from Robert Gray's beleaguered establishment, a new venture began to take shape. The construction had been swift but deliberate, the building's transformation from an empty storefront to a sleek, modern dining space executed with meticulous precision. The name of the new restaurant, emblazoned in elegant lettering, was simple yet impactful: Unity. Barron's approach was as calculated as it was visionary. Every detail of the restaurant was designed to embody the values that had been at the heart of the controversy. The menu featured dishes inspired by cuisines from around the world, emphasizing inclusivity and diversity. The staff was carefully selected, representing a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. Even the decor, a mix of contemporary design with subtle nods to different cultural aesthetics, reflected the restaurant's mission to bring people together. As news of the new restaurant spread, anticipation grew rapidly. The decision to open across the street from Robert's establishment was seen by many as a bold statement, though Barron himself remained characteristically silent. The buzz surrounding Unity was amplified by the secrecy that had surrounded its development, and by the time the grand opening was announced, the public's curiosity had reached a fever pitch. Invitations were extended to a wide array of guests, from celebrities and influencers to community leaders and everyday diners. The message was clear: everyone was welcome. The night of the grand opening was nothing short of spectacular. The street outside the restaurant was lined with photographers and reporters, their cameras flashing as high-profile guests arrived. The atmosphere was electric, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the area in the wake of the original incident. Inside, the dining room buzzed with energy as guests mingled and sampled the carefully curated menu. Each dish was a testament to the restaurant's ethos, blending flavors and techniques in a way that celebrated both individuality and unity. The symbolism of the event was impossible to ignore. What had begun as a moment of division and conflict had now given rise to something far more constructive. Barron's decision to channel the energy of the controversy into a positive endeavor resonated deeply with those in attendance. The restaurant's name, Unity, became a rallying cry for a new kind of dialogue, one that transcended political and social divides. For many, it was a reminder that even the most contentious moments could be transformed into opportunities for growth and understanding. The public's response was overwhelmingly positive. Social media was flooded with posts celebrating the opening, with photos and videos of the event quickly going viral. Influential figures from both sides of the political spectrum praised Barron's initiative, highlighting the restaurant as a symbol of resilience and forward thinking. Diners who had attended the opening shared glowing reviews, emphasizing not only the quality of the food, but also the warmth and inclusivity of the atmosphere. The narrative that had once painted Barron as a passive participant in the controversy now shifted to one of admiration and respect. As the days turned into weeks, Unity quickly established itself as a cornerstone of the community. The restaurant became a hub for meaningful conversations, hosting events and initiatives aimed at fostering understanding and collaboration. Local organizations partnered with the establishment to support charitable causes, further solidifying its reputation as a force for good. Regular diners mingled with high-profile guests, the boundaries between them blurred by the shared experience of exceptional food and genuine connection. The success of Unity also had a ripple effect on the broader conversation surrounding the incident. It served as a counterpoint to the negativity and division that had dominated the narrative, offering a tangible example of how conflict could be transformed into progress. The contrast between the two restaurants, one struggling under the weight of its decisions, the other thriving as a beacon of inclusivity, became a powerful metaphor for the choices individuals and businesses faced in an increasingly polarized world. For Robert Gray, the sight of the bustling restaurant across the street was a bitter pill to swallow. The empty tables and dwindling staff in his own establishment stood in stark contrast to the vibrant energy of Unity. The comparison was inescapable, a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. While he had once been the master of his domain, he now found himself overshadowed by a young man who had taken the controversy and turned it into something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. Meanwhile, Barron continued to operate with the same quiet determination that had defined his approach from the beginning. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to let the restaurant speak for itself. His decision to remain behind the scenes only added to the appeal of Unity, allowing it to stand as a symbol of collective effort rather than individual ambition. The message was clear. This was not about one person, but about what could be achieved when people came together. As Unity flourished, its impact extended far beyond the confines of the restaurant. It inspired similar initiatives in other communities, with businesses and organizations adopting its model of inclusivity and collaboration. The story of its creation and success became a touchstone for those seeking to navigate the challenges of a divided world, a reminder that even the most contentious moments could be opportunities for growth and understanding. By the time the initial wave of attention began to subside, Unity had firmly established itself as more than just a restaurant. It was a movement, a statement, and a testament to the power of resilience and vision. For Barron Trump, it was the ultimate masterstroke, a response that not only silenced his critics, but also elevated the conversation to a level few could have anticipated. And for those who had doubted him, the success of Unity was a reminder that sometimes the quietest actions could have the loudest impact. The evening was uncharacteristically quiet for Robert Gray as he stood across the street, gazing at the bustling scene inside Barron Trump's restaurant, Unity. The glow from the dining room spilled out onto the sidewalk, illuminating the faces of diners who laughed, clinked glasses, and shared stories over carefully crafted dishes. The contrast between this scene and his own empty restaurant couldn't have been more striking. The silence within his establishment felt heavier now, the once proud beacon of exclusivity reduced to a hollow reminder of what once was. Robert's desperation had reached a breaking point. He had spent weeks grappling with the consequences of his actions, watching as his reputation crumbled and his business faltered. Yet, amidst the chaos, he couldn't shake the pull of curiosity, or perhaps it was something deeper. Something in him needed to understand how Barron had turned the same incident that had destroyed him into the foundation of a thriving success. Dressed in a simple coat, far removed from his usual sharp suits, Robert crossed the street. Each step felt heavier than the last as he approached the entrance of Unity. The warmth of the restaurant washed over him as he stepped inside, the inviting atmosphere a stark contrast to the cold isolation he had been living in. The staff greeted him with genuine smiles, their demeanor untainted by the weight of judgment he had carried for weeks. The dining room was alive with energy, every table filled with a mix of people from all walks of life. Robert moved quietly through the space, observing the details he might have overlooked in another time. The walls were adorned with art that celebrated diversity, and the menu, placed neatly at each table, reflected the ethos of the establishment: inclusivity and connection. It was impossible not to feel the intention behind every choice, the thoughtfulness that permeated the space. For the first time in weeks, Robert felt something other than anger or despair. There was an undeniable admiration for what had been created here, a sense that this place was more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of everything he had failed to understand in his own pursuit of success. He lingered at the edge of the dining room, his presence barely noticeable amidst the buzz of activity. The hum of conversations and the clinking of glasses filled the air, creating a symphony of connection that felt both foreign and comforting. As he stood there, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had fallen and how different things might have been if he had chosen a different path. As the evening wore on, Robert's thoughts turned inward. He began to see the stark contrast between his own values and those that had built Unity. His own establishment had been a place of rigid exclusivity, a fortress designed to cater to an elite few. Here, inclusivity wasn't just a concept, it was a living, breathing part of the restaurant's identity. It wasn't about compromise or sacrificing quality. It was about finding strength in diversity, about creating something that resonated with people on a deeper level. Robert's self-reflection grew heavier as he considered the choices that had led him to this point. His insistence on enforcing a narrow vision of what his restaurant should be had alienated not only his patrons, but also his staff and community. He had let his insecurities dictate his decisions, masking them as principles. The need to assert control and maintain an image of success had blinded him to the very essence of what made a restaurant thrive: connection, understanding, and genuine care. For a moment, he wondered if it was too late for him to change. Could he rebuild from the ashes of his failure, or had he burned too many bridges to ever recover? The questions weighed heavily on him as he turned to leave, his mind swirling with uncertainty. Before he exited, his eyes caught a wall near the entrance, adorned with handwritten notes from patrons. Messages of gratitude, hope, and inspiration filled the space, each one a testament to the impact Unity had made on those who dined there. One note in particular stood out to him: true success is not measured by what you have, but by what you give. The words hit him like a revelation, piercing through the fog of doubt and despair that had clouded his mind. As Robert stepped back into the cool night air, he carried with him a new perspective. The path ahead was unclear, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. The choices he had made might have led to his downfall, but they didn't have to define his future. The lessons he had learned, painful as they were, could become the foundation for something better if he had the courage to change. Across the street, Unity continued to thrive, its light shining brightly against the darkness. And as Robert walked away, he couldn't help but feel that perhaps, in some small way, that light had begun to guide him toward a new beginning. Robert faced the mess left behind, but a small chance to start fresh gave him a new reason to keep going. A haven for everyone. The weeks following Robert Gray's visit to Unity were marked by a profound shift in his perspective. For the first time in years, he began to truly examine his motivations, his choices, and the values that had driven his career. The empty tables and silent dining room of his once thriving restaurant served as a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. Yet, instead of wallowing in regret, Robert saw an opportunity to rebuild, not just his business, but himself. Robert's path toward redemption began quietly. He sold his restaurant, acknowledging that his name and reputation had become too deeply entangled in controversy to recover. The decision was painful, but it marked the first step in his commitment to change. With the proceeds from the sale, he decided to invest in something entirely new, something that reflected the lessons he had learned. He envisioned a space where people from all walks of life could come together, a place that celebrated connection rather than division. He began by immersing himself in the communities he had once overlooked. Volunteering at local food banks and community centers, Robert saw firsthand the struggles and resilience of people who were often excluded from spaces like his former restaurant. These experiences humbled him, showing him the value of empathy and the importance of creating environments where everyone felt welcome. Slowly but surely, the rigid walls he had built around himself began to crumble, replaced by a genuine desire to contribute to something greater than his own ambition. In time, Robert found the perfect location for his new venture, a modest building on the outskirts of the city, far removed from the glitz and glamour of his previous establishment. The space was unassuming but filled with potential, its bare walls and empty floors a blank canvas for his vision. He named the restaurant Haven, a word that encapsulated his desire to create a sanctuary for all who entered. Haven was unlike anything Robert had ever attempted before. The menu was simple but thoughtful, featuring dishes made from locally sourced ingredients. The decor was warm and inviting, with communal tables that encouraged conversation and connection. Most importantly, the restaurant operated on a pay-what-you-can model, ensuring that no one was turned away because of their financial situation. It was a radical departure from the exclusivity that had once defined his career, and it felt like a long overdue course correction. Word of Haven spread quickly, drawing attention from both locals and the media. People were intrigued by Robert's transformation, curious to see whether his actions matched his intentions. The first few months were challenging. Operating a restaurant on such an unconventional model came with its own set of difficulties, but Robert's determination never wavered. He poured his heart into every aspect of the business, from greeting guests at the door to washing dishes in the kitchen. For the first time, he felt truly connected to his work and to the people it served. Meanwhile, across the city, Unity continued to flourish. Barron Trump's establishment had become more than just a restaurant. It was a movement, a symbol of what could be achieved when divisive energy was redirected towards something positive. Though Barron himself remained largely out of the public eye, his influence was undeniable. Stories of his quiet generosity and thoughtful leadership began to circulate, painting a picture of a young man whose impact extended far beyond the walls of his restaurant. The connection between Unity and Haven was subtle but significant. While the two establishments operated independently, they were bound by a shared ethos, the belief that food could be a powerful tool for unity and understanding. Patrons who visited one often found themselves drawn to the other, inspired by the complementary stories of their founders. Together, the two restaurants became symbols of resilience and transformation, proof that even the most contentious moments could lead to growth and healing. As Haven gained traction, Robert found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him to this point. He thought often of the letter he had received, its cryptic message now taking on new meaning. "What's coming cannot be stopped," it had said, and he realized now that it wasn't a warning, but a promise. The change he had resisted for so long had been inevitable, and though it had come at great cost, it had also brought him to a place of clarity and purpose. Robert's transformation did not go unnoticed. Former critics began to acknowledge his efforts, praising the authenticity of his redemption. Media outlets that had once lambasted him for his actions now ran stories highlighting the impact of Haven. Yet, for Robert, the accolades were secondary. What mattered most was the sense of fulfillment he found in his work and the connections he had forged with the people around him. As the years passed, the legacies of both Robert and Barron became intertwined with the broader narrative about the power of kindness and resilience. Their stories were told in classrooms and community centers, used as examples of how individuals could rise above their mistakes and make meaningful contributions to the world. The restaurants they had built became more than just businesses. They were symbols of hope and possibility, reminders that even the most fractured communities could find ways to come together. For Barron, the path had always been about more than just a restaurant. Unity was a reflection of his belief in the power of subtle but impactful actions, in the importance of creating spaces where people felt valued and seen. His ability to lead without seeking the spotlight became a hallmark of his legacy, inspiring others to embrace humility and thoughtfulness in their own pursuits. Though he rarely spoke publicly, his influence was felt in countless ways, a quiet force for good in a world often defined by noise. Robert's story, too, became a testament to the power of reflection and change. His willingness to confront his own flaws and rebuild from the ground up served as a powerful reminder that redemption was always possible, no matter how far one had fallen. Haven stood as a beacon of that redemption, a place where people came not just to eat, but to connect, to heal, and to find solace in one another's company. Was Barron Trump's response a stand for free expression, or was it a bold message to those who judge too quickly? Tell us what you think, and remember to like and subscribe for more.